Yeah, well, he was a jackass, but he was my hero when I was 10 years old.
Of course, I mean, they were a good team. You hate it when you don't make a team
Right.
that good.
Yeah.
Like the Patriots now.
Right. Well, they weren't even a patch on what the Patriots are these days, but sure.
Oh, nice.
I'm really not gonna leave that in.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name is Leanne. I'm the Education Coordinator at the People's Forum, and I'd like to welcome you all to our space. I see some familiar faces, so for those of you who don't know, we are a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities. We have educational, cultural programming. We have a resource center, and as an education coordinator, I want to hear all your ideas, so feel free to reach out to me at any time. Also, this is a place to build community, build knowledge, build solidarity. So if this is your first time, your second time, or your 10th time, please keep coming. We want to keep talking, we want to keep building, so please check out our calendar and stop in any time. With that, we are honored and we are humbled to have this amazing panel tonight. We really do aim to showcase innovative scholarship that's urgent and relevant to building social movements. And even though we're all the way up here in New York, we know that true revolutionary change cannot take place without revolutionary movement in the South. So this is one of the reasons why this panel really aligns with our mission. It's going to help us understand better the intersections of race, class, and power in the concrete history of movement building in the South. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start all the way at the end with Keri Leigh Merritt. Keri Leigh works as a historian and a writer in Atlanta, Georgia. She earned her BA from Emory University and her MA and PhD from the University of Georgia. Her first book, Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South, won both the Bennett Wall Award from the Southern Historical Association and as well as the President's Book Award from the Social Science History Association. Keri Leigh is also co-editor of Reconsidering Southern Labor History, Race, Class, Power, and Power. She's currently conducting research for 2 additional book projects. One will be on radical black resistance in the still understudied Reconstruction era, and the second project examines the changing role of law enforcement in the mid-19th century South. Merritt also writes historical pieces for the public, and she has had letters and essays published in Aeon, Bill Moyers, The Bitter Southerner, Salon, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Next is Dr. Hilary Green. She is the Associate Professor of History and in the Department of Gender and Race Studies, and also serves as the co-program at Confederate Memorial Debates, and she is also working on several pieces exploring the enslaved experience at the University of Alabama and other topics on the African American experience during the long Reconstruction era. We also have Bob Hutton. He is the Senior Lecturer of History and American Studies at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He received his doctorate from Vanderbilt University and also studied at Appalachian State University and George Mason University. His first book, Bloody Breathitt, Politics and Violence in the Appalachian South, received awards from the Appalachian Studies Association, the Appalachian Writers Association, the Kentucky Historical and the Kentucky Historical Society. His current project is tentatively titled Dixie's Detectives, the Baldwin Felts Agency and the Building of Appalachian Capitalism, and it's supported by the Jonathan G. Utley History Support Fund and the Mining History Association. He's also an active member of the United Campus Workers, Local 3865. And finally, we have Booker T. Mattison. He is an author and a filmmaker. He wrote the screenplay and directed the film adaptation of Zora Neale Hurston's Starred Review and Publishers Weekly. And he received his Master of Fine Arts in Film and Television from the Tisch School of Arts at the New York University and a Bachelor of Science from Norfolk State University. Presently, he's teaching film and television studies, television production and screenwriting, in the Department of Entertainment and Media Studies at the University of Georgia. So clearly some very, very talented and knowledgeable panelists. So I'm really excited to hear from you, and we'll start with Keri.
Thank you all for coming out on a Friday night. We so appreciate it. I want to start with a little quote from the Georgia populist leader, Tom Watson. He said this in 1892. "You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. And he's telling this to a crowd of both blacks and poor whites. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism which enslaves you both. And he even continued, you are deceived and blinded that you may not see how this race antagonism perpetuates a monetary system which beggars both. And kind of a leading, guiding question for this whole panel, and we'll give little brief intros and kind of open it up to a roundtable and then even open up to you guys to interact and ask some questions. How do we conceptualize the South? Right? What do people from outside of the South think of the South? I know, coming from the state of Mississippi, that many times people think of the South as ignorant, as racist, as backwards. You don't usually see the South and the word progressivism in the same sentence. And I argue, as do all of my co-panelists, that that's absolutely wrong, right? The South is actually a bastion of progressivism. It has just always been stamped out by the tiny elite who still controls pretty much everything. And once this elite is finally overthrown, and we're coming very close, as you've seen in the last election cycle, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Mike Espy in Mississippi, even in Doug Jones in Alabama, right? There is this overwhelming progressiveness. And the cities and towns even, the mayors and the leaders of these towns, they're even more progressive. They're not liberal, they are absolutely progressive. Social Democrats. And there are all these movements, of African Americans in the United States. But due to that fact, and due to our nation's history of slavery and the failure of reparations, coupled with the racist policies that followed, whether that be redlining, whether that be banks not giving loans, or any other kind of discrimination, segregation in housing or lending, the racial wealth gap is huge in America, and it's something that mainstream media really doesn't talk about. And the racial wealth gap was created by policy and is maintained by policy, and even policies today that are not actually racist in letter, and sometimes even policies that are formed in order to help people get out of poverty end up having the opposite effect many times and are used in a racist way. Now, titling this panel "The Southernization of America," I think we're kind of trying to show that the problems that we've seen in this country recently have actually echoed problems that we've seen in the South over the last 150 years, whether that be unfree labor, different forms of unfree labor, which in the South, unfree labor for black people and poor whites lasts nearly into the 1930s, the New Deal era. Low wages. South still has the lowest wages of anywhere in the country. The lack of collective bargaining rights, right to work, that originated in the South, in the Deep South. And it originated as a racist policy. And slowly the rest of the nation has adopted these policies. The violent repression of unions, which goes hand in hand with that. And the lack of basic social safety nets, whether that be health care. Right now, Deep South states are literally turning down millions and millions of federal dollars, not accepting Medicaid, Medicare expansion, and I mean, residents are dying. Our people are dying. They're sick and they're dying, and it's really a crisis. And at some point, something's either going to change, or there is going to be, I think, an uprising of the people. Now, this racial wealth gap that I have talked about, the idea of slavery without reparations. This is something that is coming back up politically now, but to think about when emancipation happens in 1865, black people in America own about 0.5% of the entire wealth in the United States, 0.5%. And in early Reconstruction, they actually make really big strides, earning money, saving money, putting money in banks. And every time there's a depression, though, it absolutely wipes out the wealth of most of black America. And even in this last recession, 2007, 2008, it wipes out half of black wealth in America. It hurts whites, but it wipes out half of black wealth. And right now in America, all wealth, African Americans only own about 1% of the wealth in America. That is the disparity. And things are looking worse. Unless there's some kind of policy, unless there's some kind of federal intervention, or even state intervention on some levels, this is not going to get better. We have to start taking reparations seriously. We have to start having conversations about, economists like Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton have talked about baby bonds. We have to really start examining these kinds of issues in order to figure out how we can make America a more equitable place. Now, the upside of all of this is I think the South shows us that there are cycles of hope and promise. I show in my book, Masterless Men, that under slavery, there were actually a lot of personal relationships between blacks and poor whites. There was a whole underground trading network where the enslaved would trade whatever they raised on the plantations with poor whites, usually for liquor. But they had this whole business community, underground economy. There were personal relationships. There were families. There was actually a lot of interracial relationships among the poor. But once emancipation happens, racial lines harden. Right. Upper class whites are pulling poor whites into the privileges of whiteness, and at the same time, making sure blacks are pushed back down to the bottom of society. But I argue that every time there's a major depression, a major financial crash in America, that there is actually an opportunity for a multiracial or biracial coalition of people. And we see this during the early years of Reconstruction until it's stamped out by voter suppression and violence of the Klan. We see this in populism. Populism in the South is huge. It's a really big deal. There are, governments. North Carolina is governed by a biracial coalition of people at this time. And then you see it again in the New Deal. And then again in the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s. And so historians call the Civil Rights Movement a second Reconstruction, right? It was the second time the federal government really stepped in and tried to give civil rights to all of Americans. And this is, of course, the same time that the original Poor People's Campaign under Martin Luther King starts in 1968. And of course, this is conceptualized as being a multiracial coalition. The people who are in Resurrection City, you've got Puerto Ricans, blacks, poor whites, every ethnicity you can think of are here together living in this Resurrection City. And I think that we'll see once we get through all of this panel that as bad as things are right now, as seemingly bleak as the last few years have been, the one good thing that might come out of all of this is that when we swing really far right in America, there's usually almost a pendulum swing back to the left. And I think that we will have a real chance, once the current administration is gone, to really kind of grapple with our own history and figure out what we need to do to basically create a third Reconstruction in America, to create another real self-examination of how do we level the playing field somewhat to make things equitable for all Americans. And, historically, there are, I think, three main factors that government looks at in trying to achieve this equity. And so Hilary is going to talk about education, Bob's going to talk about labor, and Booker's going to talk about the arts. And just thinking about the New Deal, you had the WPA giving all these jobs to artists. And it wasn't just to give people a job. They used art in order to help shape people's minds, make people's minds up about policy, about government, about why government is doing good things for them. And I think a lot of times, when we think about politics now, we don't bring art into it, and art is absolutely integral. And I think, especially for the younger generation now, right? We're moving towards, we need to have video, we need to have podcasts, we need things other than the written form. And so I really am excited to see what Booker's going to do. But I want to end with this one quote by W.E.B. Du Bois. And it says, "To be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in the land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships." And the South, I think, can help give us some answers to these questions.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about my work on Reconstruction education, but also too how I'm going to use a term that I wrote about in my book called educator activists. These are ordinary people that are coming out of slavery who are building a system of schools from the ground up because they came out with the desire that they were not going to be slaves. And one of the things that they weren't going to have was the denial to be educated. And so they put in their money, their times, and those who worked in those schools, and then the generations of children of future school teachers are trained in the civil rights movement of the long civil rights, Jim Crow era, and that legacy. But also in many ways, what they demanded was quality public schools, and that those in those schools didn't see their activism as limited in the classroom, but then they affected the communities around them. So that's where I'm going to really talk about. And I'm going to open up with a quote of an unknown African-American woman who is writing in the early 1880s a New Year's request for prayers from the New York Black newspaper. And she's writing to Black New Yorkers to think about Virginia and think about Norfolk and to think about those Southern African Americans who are fighting against violence, and this all they want to do is be educated and have jobs. At the close of the war, we were left to crawl. We crawled as well as we could. And when the time came for us to walk, we had no one to stretch out their hands to encourage us to walk. But we did walk. True, it was slowly but surely. As a scholar of Reconstruction era and early African American education, my work looks at this transformation from building where education of African American children was illegal to a state right of citizenship, and lay the foundation of Black education, and also built and established a cadre of race men, women, and children that will carry on this mission to be educated and a better future for African Americans, but also the nation, because they wanted a biracial, cross-class, just world in which their difference and their slave past didn't matter. And by focusing on the actions of ordinary African Americans and their white allies, my work offers new insights for understanding this era's greatest achievement. Even W.E.B. Du Bois's classic work, Black Reconstruction, he even identifies the Black schoolhouse as one of the crowning jewels of Reconstruction. And indeed it was, when you think about the millions of dollars in there and what these individuals accomplished. And they built a Southern system of education, and they built the mechanisms for sustaining those schools that survived. But more importantly, they developed a mindset of future leaders for their communities that could take their education and apply it for good, but also acquire social capital and economic opportunity that was once denied. And how did they do this? They did it very simply. They asked for quality public schools. And that means they wanted accommodations, actually school buildings. They wanted school board representation that actually addressed the needs of their community. They wanted teachers that looked like them. And they always would say colored teachers for colored schools, but they would be okay anyone who would come in didn't see it as a paycheck. And they wanted equitable funding. And their efforts were so successful that it took the Jim Crow era to actively dismantle that system of schools and also silence those gains that were achieved during the first Reconstruction in textbooks by calling Reconstruction a mistake, and also purporting that African Americans historically and in the present never valued education and were content with inferior public schools, and therefore undeserving of public dollars to support those largely Black and brown children in those public school systems. So with calls by Reverend William Barber of North Carolina and other Southern activists for a third Reconstruction, and by historians of education scholars like John Hale, who wrote about the citizenship schools of the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights Movement, and even myself, and maybe reviving another quality public school campaign to address the needs of the current schools. I have seen ordinary folks in Alabama wield this long history of education, social justice activism, and a legacy of distancing themselves from that slave past as weapons in this current day struggle. Educators like myself have been on the front lines of combating the current political moment of purposeful misinformation about the region in our classrooms. I teach 19th century Black history, so I use the Alabama literacy tests. I have my students take it. I show them the passes, and I even use my campus that has a history of slavery on it to also George Wallace standing at the schoolhouse door. So I use the campus as my classroom. And these are my future, a lot of my students go on to work for SBLC, EGI, and others. These are the next generation. So again, I'm building upon that early past. But other educators, all these panelists here, we do this in our communities, and we do this in our public engagement. We are providing the tools, the language, and the historical context for current day issues, whether it's resegregation of schools. In the case of Tuscaloosa, it went from the model school system to now 98% Black because of a backroom deal, and to determine what the percentage of the high school would be white or Black. And as a result, very few students from Tuscaloosa of color actually attend the University of Alabama. And also look at policing, but also the policing of Black children in those classrooms and schoolhouses, the school to prison pipeline, and voter suppression, because in Alabama and the Black Belt with mobile ID units, we have another form of suppression in terms of access. This time it's money and a card to get an ID. With all these, and by doing this, educators like myself, we are the modern day manifestations of these educator activists that I write about, who are walking slowly but surely. We are also coalition building with others and community allies to build a different and more just Alabama, the region, and the nation. And the impetus for a lot of the work in the coalition building I'm a part of in Tuscaloosa began days after the 2016 presidential election. Meeting in local restaurants and community centers, a diverse group of women, and it's women, white, Black, Asian, Native Alabamian, and transplants like myself, the old, a lot of them were foot soldiers in the civil rights movement to today, the young. Highly educated. A lot of the women who were meeting either had a master's degree or higher. We were Democrat Socialist, and Republican. And a lot of us had ties to the schools, both currently and retired. But we came together after the election when it became clear that the hospital in the Black Belt might close, and seeing more people having to drive over 100 miles to Tuscaloosa because we are the closest hospital, and to see people going as far as Birmingham for dental care, and the lack of expansion of Medicaid, we came together because we had to fix our state and our communities. Because to paraphrase Fannie Lou Hamer, we were sick and tired of being sick and tired. And we were looking for better schools, fighting hospital closures, the opioid abuse. Many of them are taking care of their relatives who are fighting from this disease, and the consequences of neglect from our local, state, and federal officials. So from book drives for low-performing schools without classroom libraries or full librarians at their schools, to voter registration canvassing, to postcard writing campaigns for the Doug Jones election, but also the midterm elections in Alabama and neighboring states of Mississippi and Georgia at a local brewery, to driving individuals to get an ID from mobile DMV units, because under Obama, but continued under Jeff Sessions, the Black Belt 23 counties don't have a permanent DMV. They have to go to a mobile unit, and that unit changes every week in different locations. and you get a week's notice, to actually driving people to the polls on election day because they don't have car or fare to Uber. We are also serving as poll watchers. We are the modern day individuals who take what we write about, what we teach in our classroom to affect change in our communities and our larger region. We are also actively ignoring the stereotypical media images of Alabama. Rather, we are fighting. In effect, I am that educated African-American woman that everyone talks about in the media, but never comes to ask and see what we're doing. And I'm working with other women and other progressive Alabamians who have always been there. And in this last election, it's no coincidence that Emerge Alabama was not only the fastest growing statewide version of Emerge, and the coalition building led to the largest number of women to run for political office in the state of Alabama, but also in the nation. Even though we did not have a Jones-like victory during the midterm elections, we are moving the political needle. We got about 40% of the vote. When I arrived, it was at 10%. So we are progressive. We look at it and see where we're going, and we're still fighting. So what can be learned from the other Alabama, as we call ourselves? And we've always been there, from the first and second Reconstructions. And we're building on that legacy. So from polling my current students and UA faculty, and also members of the Tuscaloosa Democrats and other community members, including my hair salon, I want to conclude with some statements on what they want you to know. We exist. We are diverse. We are not the stereotypes of a backward state or region. We have elected progressive mayors, Randall Wolfen of Birmingham and Walt Maddox of Tuscaloosa, to name two, and other politicians. In the same state that has produced many SNL cold openings and even the S-Town podcast, it has also produced many civil rights movement victories, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Equal Justice Initiative, and Doug Jones's, now Senator Doug Jones's victory. Voter suppression is real and is not going away, and that's one of our biggest challenges. Please fund grassroots efforts and organizations, and not just the national ones, because money barely comes down to those on the ground doing the work. But more importantly, learn about and amplify our efforts as we are continuing that long fight for this inclusive and just society, from emancipation to the present. We do not need saviors, rather we need allies who will join us as equal partners. But if we are to have a third Reconstruction, which I see the moves towards, it'll be people like me and other educator activists and members of the other Alabama who will be essential to this transformation of the nation. We are fighting and building on the spirit of this long struggle, and we want to end notions that progressives can't learn from this diverse South. Rather, I think we have a lot to teach everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Keri Leigh originally titled this panel "The Southernization of the United States," and it just occurred to me earlier this evening that a journalist whose name escapes me right at the moment referred it was the guy who wrote "What's Wrong with Kansas," and perhaps some of y'all can help me. Thank you. Recently, it referred to what he called the Appalachification of the United States, a term that I'm inclined to think he meant something very similar to what Keri Leigh was suggesting, but I think it has a different connotation to it. When people hear the word Appalachia, they don't necessarily think about the South, and when people think about the South, they don't necessarily think about Appalachia. Now, there are some very good reasons for that. One of them being that Appalachia is not fully contained within the traditional South. You got to include Pennsylvania, you got to include West Virginia, you got to include Ohio when you're talking about Appalachia. But I come from southern Appalachia, an area that both is emblematic of these other issues that we've already heard about with the rest of the South, but yet at the same time sort of defies them in other ways too. one of the misapprehensions that many Americans have about Appalachia, or at least that they have when they hear the word Appalachia, is the assumption that this is an all-white part of the country. When you picture somewhere like, say, Beckley, West Virginia, you're thinking of a place that's definitely devoid of cultural or certainly racial diversity. Of course, there's some truth to this, and of course, whenever NPR Morning Edition or whatever visits a place like, say, Grundy, Virginia, they don't try to find that age-old black community that has been there since at least the 1880s. No, they're going to find someone that they don't really have to explain because they have, a little limited amount of time, so they seek out a white person. What a lot of Americans don't know is that Appalachia was, well, for one thing, originally the domain of the Mingo, Shawnee, Iroquois, Cherokee, and a number of other nations that were certainly not white. A number of others whose I can't think of at the moment. But yet at the same time also, 200 years after that, it was a place where slavery came into its second phase. The plantation phase that began in the 17th century moved westward into the Appalachian hills and mountains of Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee, and set the stage for what eventually became the third phase of King Cotton, which most people are more familiar with. A very large number of people who found themselves enslaved in the Mississippi Delta by the 1840s and 1850s originated in places like central Kentucky or eastern Tennessee. And that created a sort of reciprocal relationship between the two. Even after that, of course, the Appalachia served as an escape for freed people after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. We think of the Great Migration as being black Southerners leaving the South entirely. Actually, the first phase of the Great Migration was black Southerners coming to places like eastern Kentucky, western Virginia, and southern West Virginia. Your namesake, Booker T. Washington, one of the more famous examples, a former coal miner before he became an educator. And of course, years after that, after the more famous Great Migration had taken place, Appalachia gave birth to a large, significant number of great black Americans. The comedian Moms Mabley and the singer Nina Simone are both claimed by Western North Carolina. Before them, of course, Chattanooga gave birth to Bessie Smith. If you're familiar with Steve Harvey, you may not know that he's from southern West Virginia. And my personal favorite, of course, is I grew up on the same road as a man named Frankie Newton. And I think New Yorkers probably are more familiar with Frankie Newton than most people in southwestern Virginia are these days. He is the guy playing the trumpet on the original recording of Strange Fruit. And he lived down in Greenwich Village up until the 1950s as a remnant of black Appalachia that perhaps no one really knew about by the end of his life. Of course, these days, Appalachia remains multinational, multiracial, because we have what I call Appalachian America. Part of my family, of course, my sister married into a family from Mexico, and I have 3 nephews and a niece, all of whom have Latinx heritage as well as Anglo-Appalachian heritage too. So I want to echo what's already been said about the South and basically imprint it on Appalachia as well, but also to mention that it's not an entirely white space. And for that matter, it's a place that's had the same sort of racial divisions based on economics that you see in many other parts of the South. Most people, when they think of Appalachia, the first thing that comes to mind is coal. And of course, there's a good reason for that. And by the way, the coal that is burned by Con Edison comes from Appalachia, and I'd like to say you're welcome. we are not limited only to a coal or extraction-based economy. Appalachia also is one part of the South, Southern Appalachia, that has come to depend on an entertainment and tourism-based economy, especially in places like Eastern Tennessee, North Georgia, and Western North Carolina. A sort of resort economy that seems like a somewhat more advantageous kind of way of living than what you would expect from a coal town. When in fact, if you visit a place like, say, Sevier County, Tennessee, Cocke County, Tennessee, the area around the Great Smoky Mountains, you run into places where the wages are pretty much lower than they are in coal country. The jobs are relatively plentiful, but they're typically seasonal. And you see the same sort of poverty level, you see the same sort of out-migration as you do in many. In Appalachia, we're sort of trapped between two very different economies, both of which basically promise very low wages. Excuse me. One other reputation that Appalachia does have that perhaps the South also shares, but it's not as well known, is that we do have a famous history of labor organization. We are coming up very soon on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Blair Mountain, when West Virginia coal miners attempted to take once and for all absolute control of their means of production in southern West Virginia. And of course it almost happened were it not for the infiltration of the federal government. It was the first time that the first time the U.S. military ever used aircraft against Americans. Maybe one of the last times, actually. I'm a member of a labor union that some of y'all may consider unusual. Is there anyone in here who's part of an academic union of sorts? Thought we might have. I knew we'd have at least one person in here. United Campus Workers, which began at the campus I now teach at and is now spreading to other schools in the South, is unusual in that it is a wall-to-wall union. That is, if you are an employee of the university, it does not matter whether you're an educator, whether you're a member of the staff, as long as you're drawing a paycheck from the university, you're eligible to be a member. This has meant a lot of challenges that wouldn't necessarily be found by someone who's a member of a faculty union, but it's also meant we've been able to thrive somewhat even in a state that's so-called right to work. We don't always necessarily show up on the radar of our state government, except of course on the days that we show up at the state capitol. But there's a significant number of people even in Tennessee who think that labor unions are actually illegal. A lot of the reason for that is that a so-called right-to-work law makes it very difficult to have one. It doesn't make it illegal necessarily, but also because we live in a part of the country where violence was used so often and so successfully against organized workers that it created a more or less permanent mindset, even through the New Deal, even certainly afterward, that what we're doing is going against, if not technically the law, is actually going against the better interests of society. So we often have a very hard time trying to get people to join a union because a lot of people who grow up and come to get a job at our university for, say, $13 an hour or less, grew up not really understanding what organized labor was. So that's been a very important chore for us. I was very pleased when I met Frances Fox Piven when she visited us 2.5 years ago. She came down and she said she actually was not aware that unions like ours exist, an actual wall-to-wall union at a university that's following something like the old wobbly model. So as little hope as we sometimes have on the political front in the South, I do think that organized labor is possibly one of our best hopes for the future. Unlike what we have in Georgia and Alabama, where I was very happy to hear about a significant uprise in voter turnout for the last couple of elections. In the Upper South, especially Tennessee and West Virginia, for what it's worth, we have some of the lowest voter turnout on average for any state in the United States. Tennessee and West Virginia typically they switch off between 49 and 50 when it comes to congressional and presidential elections. And that is both a cause and an effect of the economic problems we've dealt with in the last few years. But there are times when people can get together and make change without actually having to wait for Election Day. And that's what I hope that United Campus Workers is trying to do. I'm also hoping that we're going to soon be at a campus in Tuscaloosa. And we're already at a campus in Athens. And I didn't bring a union card for Booker to sign tonight, but I'm going to be emailing him one very soon because he is an eligible member should he choose to join. I don't mean to push you in front of everybody like this, but we are spreading we are existent in one form or another in 4 states now. And our organizers, really all they told me to tell y'all tonight was that fact. We are becoming much bigger. And it's interesting because when I joined at the University of Tennessee, I never expected it to get any bigger than what it was. So one thing I want people to know about Southern Appalachia is don't believe everything you read in the media. Don't believe everything you hear on NPR. And do understand that some of us are still out there trying to make things happen. We haven't all given up. And that's one thing that we do have in common with the rest of the South. Thank y'all.
Thomas Edison once said that whoever controls the motion picture industry controls the most powerful medium of influence over the people. Of course, now that includes more than just motion pictures. It's also television, internet content. What makes me so excited about being a filmmaker is the ability to impact people. Throughout history, story has transformed minds and transformed hearts. One of the biggest challenges about the motion picture industry, because segregation is still so powerful, many of us learn about other cultures based upon what we see in visual media. So I wanted to just introduce a couple of terms to contextualize my discussion about the influence of the arts and how the South is presented in media. First, we're communicating with images. And images is the visual language of film, and it's speaking a language that speaks very loudly, and often this language is so powerful that people refuse to accept something different than what they've been fed. I tell my students often that all of our cinematic IQs are through the roof because we've been watching movies since we were born. And story, we've been introduced, if you're like my parents, since you're in utero, your parents reading you stories. Image is a representation of an external form of a thing. So it can be good or it can be bad. Often the way the South is presented in visual media, we're left with caricatures, and I define that as characters who are devoid of a truthful inner life. And if we don't have a truthful inner life and it's just the external form of a thing, we're left with an incomplete image which is in fact untrue. So I want to show a short montage of 3 films that I'm sure we all know. The first being The Birth of a Nation, the first Hollywood blockbuster from 1915, and the clip, of course, has a white actor in blackface. Then Deliverance, which incidentally was shot in North Georgia. And then finally, Driving Miss Daisy, where God, Morgan Freeman, doesn't know how to read. That's no fun.
I can't read, Miss Daisy.
Then how come I see you looking at the paper all the time?
Well, that's just it. I just be looking. Well, I kind of know about what's going on from the pictures sometimes.
You know your letters, don't you?
Oh, yes, my little ABC is pretty good. Just can't read.
Stop saying that. You're making me mad.
So the South, as represented in film, and when I told my students that I was coming here and what the topic was, I asked the question, how many of you, most of my students are from you, when people discover that you're from the South, they treat you as if you're an alien, as if you are an other. And these are mostly white students. I have very few black students at UGA. And of course, it's not only because of film, the way people perceive Southerners, but it has a lot to do with that. Incidentally, at the University of Georgia, we are starting an MFA in production program. And part of the economic progressivism that's happening in the state is the reason why we did $9.5 billion in film production in 2017, because you get 30% back from the state of Georgia whenever you shoot in the state. So we are creating an MFA in film production because most of the work that we have in Georgia is production. Pre-production and post-production still happens in Los Angeles. So the above-the-line workers, the producers, the directors, the writers, those who are creating these images, they fly in, shoot a film or television show, fly back out. So we're designing this program to create an above-the-line workforce. And what's revolutionary about it is we're competing with the Florida states, the NYUs, the Columbias, where at NYU now I believe it's $51,000 a year to go to film school. I believe Columbia is somewhere in that same neighborhood. So what we're doing is we're charging tuition that is significantly lower, which is revolutionary because it will allow content creators of color to come in and be able to learn those skills necessary to tell stories where we're not limiting the presentation of the South to caricature those characters that are devoid of a truthful inner life. And in my own films, and I'll show a montage of my films, what I try to do is tell stories that are representative of the South that I know, people who look like me. The first clip that we'll see is a story of a man who can't get over the death of his father, so he steals his body from the funeral home. But in this story, it's about a father, a black father, passing on a legacy to his son. The second clip is the story of an athlete who is wrongfully accused, who's wrongfully imprisoned, and it addresses sexual violence in prison and also false imprisonment. And finally, a clip which is really interesting, my most recent short film, is the story of a white Bosnian Muslim who's forced to immigrate to the United States after his mother is killed by ISIS in Bosnia. And his father wants him to assimilate and take advantage of the privilege of being white in the United States. But he discovers that he has more in common with African Americans than whites because of the discrimination that he experiences as a Muslim in America. And where I live in Lawrenceville, Georgia, which is suburban Atlanta, we have a very large Bosnian American community. And that's not something that people usually think about when you think about the South. I mean, Muslims, period. But add to that, white Muslims. But we don't think about that largely because of how the South is presented in media. So let's show this next clip. This is like counterintuitive to control this behind you with your fingers. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd say so. Because you can't rightly call something a miracle unless it's made out of the impossible. Right? I'm happy you turned things around, son. Because eternity waits for no one, not even me.
That's why you need to stop trying to be Mr. Fix-It.
What I'm saying is that you're ready to take the torch.
You hold the torch for now, Pop. At least till I get a family of my own.
Yeah.
rise. For the charge of armed robbery, the jury finds the defendant guilty. Have a good day. We will. In Bosnia, I lost my mother. But in America, I found my father and a brother.
So that's that. Yeah. Okay. Picturization, expressing a dramatic or thematic idea with images. And as it relates to the stories that I see other Southern content creators creating, and incidentally, all of these clips, the actors are actually from the South, and they're portraying characters that are from the South, and they're created by myself, who's actually from the South. So what I want people to know about the South is that, one, we are progressive economically when we're talking about the Georgia Film Academy, which is a state-sponsored initiative that was designed to create below-the-line workers, the blue-collar filmmakers, the grips, the PAs, but also the 30% tax break that we get, which is the reason why we are now the #3 film and television location in the world. But also that content creators from the South, we wasn't dangerous, that I actually, could think, and that I had something to contribute. The only ways that he had experienced black people was, and this was in 1995, CNN, BET, and American hip hop. So that was a great way for me to be introduced to the power of media, because filmed entertainment is also one of America's biggest exports. So this negative portrayal of Southerners in film doesn't just impact how we're viewed in the United States, it also impacts how we're viewed around the world. So my hope is that through films that I'm able to make, and through students that I'm able to mentor, and through creating this above-the-line workforce in the state of Georgia, that we'll have a complete picture of who the South is and how we can contribute to film entertainment.
So we wanted to just open it up to you all to see if there was a certain topic you wanted to touch back on or have any questions. One of the things we talked about, we met this morning, is that the South actually experiences deindustrialization. It experienced deindustrialization really in the 80s. It was pretty much complete by the 90s. All the textile mills that were mainly in Appalachia, but also in the deep South states, all pretty much packed up and moved to China and different areas of Asia. And that really started this culture of severe poverty in these rural areas where people used to have jobs. They weren't well-paying jobs, but they were at least jobs. And it has led us basically to the crisis that we're in now in these rural areas. Hilary talked about the lack of hospitals. Hospitals are going out of business all over the rural South right now. And there's a big study by the economist Case and Deaton that shows that even for white people, poor white people, working class white people in America, lifespans are shortening, right? They're living shorter lives than even their forefathers, and this has never happened in the history of our country. And the reason that part of this is happening is suicides. It's the carceral state. It's people that don't have a reason to really live because they don't have an identity through their work or their jobs. They're turning to opioids, they're turning to heroin, they're turning to any kind of escape they can find. And it's creating a real crisis in poor communities, especially poor rural communities right now. And I just wanted to open that up and see what the panelists have to say.
One of the things I see in Tuscaloosa, but also too, because my uncle's in the back here from South Carolina, in South Carolina post-Hugo, we also have natural disasters that bring about change and don't never recover. And so in the case of Tuscaloosa, the tornado that went through the heart of the campus, over 60 people killed, that led to my first move there, open lots of this red clay and slow development. With gentrification of Birmingham, these new places, a lot of those buildings were emptied when Sloss and other factories at ironworks left. We also have, in a case when I moved less than 10-minute drive from Tuscaloosa going to the Mississippi line, people don't have broadband, but we have schools, so they're in the parking lots of the libraries until midnight so they can access the online classroom submissions. And then also to the opioid crisis, and one of the reasons why I really got in tune with this was the women who are left behind who had to take care of the children and the family members because their sons and daughters were going for the rehab for the third time, and they had pulled all their resources to get them help, but then they had to stand in for the children who were there. But every day, the poverty level, I run into at my local Starbucks when we're not talking about football, and Roll Tide. They are talking about how am I going to pay for my medicine? How am I going to get to, I hope I don't have to come back to make this drive out here because I just drove 3 hours to go to the hospital. And when one of the most crisis points came, and Terry Sewell held a last minute meeting about the healthcare plan because the administration was talking about getting rid of the care, was talking to a farmer who almost lost his arm in a hail bale. And he had to be flown to Birmingham to save his arm. But the thing was, that was his first time he had health care that he could afford. And if he didn't have that, he would have lost his arm. And to see the levels of poverty, the flight out, and those who come in for jobs like Mercedes-Benz is up the road, none of them are coming from the state. They're coming outside in extraction. But we have people who are looking at this and that care. And the last thing I'll add is, I'm not sure if you have read about it, but the UN actually came to the rural part of the state that I live in West Alabama. And they were talking about the environmental racism between the oil industry, the toxic waste and sewage, half-mile where I half hour.
What Keri Leigh said reminded me of two relatively different trends that we see developing in both the Upper South and I guess corridor areas like Chattanooga that sort of connect the Deep South to the Upper South. The first thing is an overarching hyper-masculine political culture that has caused a lot of Southerners to believe that we don't need infrastructure. And this isn't something that we necessarily come to naturally. It's something that's engendered by the political elites that we've ended up having in office in places like Tennessee, North Carolina, to a lesser extent Virginia, because on the flip side of the coin, or this isn't just happening in Virginia, but the flip side of the coin is while that's going on in the State House, you have a kind of gentrification being driven by, as you pointed out, Mercedes-Benz coming into Alabama. Elsewhere, you got Volkswagen coming into Chattanooga. The big one in the room right now in Tennessee, Virginia, and well, apparently it was almost in the works up here, but it's about to fall through. Amazon. Amazon is about to completely take over a big chunk of Nashville. Driving a large number of people out of a part of the community that has been just sort of on a precipice for many years. And the gentrification that one sees, it's always been driven by the private sector, but now we're starting to see gentrification driven by massive corporations that in a sort of sideways way are starting to take over the role that was once filled by local or perhaps state government. And this is a real danger for our future. It's a condition one already sees in a place like, say, the outer D.C. area of, let's say, central Maryland or northern Virginia. But this is an area with relatively high wages. What happens when Amazon's massive warehouse in Chattanooga becomes practically the only employer in a particular part of town, especially if the other major employer in Chattanooga decides to move out, that being Volkswagen. Volkswagen can move out anytime they want to, really. It's a really hyper extenuated version of what's been called the gig economy developing in a lot of the parts of the South. And I think we're probably going to end up seeing some of the more extreme iterations of gig economy type living in many parts of the South. It's a long way away from the sharecropping that some of us have researched in our own work. It's a long way away from the extractive industries that I've researched. But it's also a good example of how, your Southern economy ends up being nothing more than a very magnified version of what you see in the rest of the country. And I think even though it's very easy to look at some of our older institutions and blame them, and of course they don't help either, this much newer, larger, massive institution, the multinational or post-national corporation, is probably what's going to end up driving it. And one of the biggest dangers we get, not necessarily from Amazon, but from other corporations that are operating in the South, is the end of people expecting clean drinking water. That's something people just don't even think of as a right, let alone a privilege anymore. So these are some of the thoughts that come to my mind. What's going on in Gwinnett County?
Well, what I find to be interesting about the film industry, and you talked about messaging and how different political positions are couched and presented to voters. Let's be honest. I mean, what's happening with the 30% in Georgia, it is a handout. It is a giveaway. And this happened under the guise of a Republican governor, Nathan Deal. And people don't have an issue with it. Why? Because of the $9.5 billion that you see coming into the Georgia economy in 2017. Of course, there are concerns about the new governor and whether or not he will enact social policy that will make Hollywood skittish and they'll pull out. But if we look at North Carolina and their burgeoning film industry, which is all but dried up because conservative governments came in, they got rid of the incentives, and the workforce that was developing in North Carolina, guess where they went to? Georgia. The same thing was happening in Louisiana. They had a robust incentive program, a giveaway, which is a typically liberal position. Conservative government comes in, they remove the incentives. Same thing happened in Virginia. Then you see the labor transferring over to Georgia. So for me, it's actually a good thing seeing what government can do and how quickly government intervention can not only transform a community, but can create new industries that had never existed before. I finished film school in 1999. And when I came out, you had to live in Los Angeles or New York if you wanted to have a career. There's just no other way, where are you gonna live? Now, when I'm talking to students, it's Los Angeles, New York, or Atlanta. And that's a direct result of handouts. That's a direct result of government intervention. I'm glad that I see that happening in my industry. Unfortunately, it's not happening in other industries that we've discussed during the panel.
And this is largely why a lot of us in the South are trying to conceive of new ways. What is labor going to look like in the South in the next 10 years? And I think what it's going to have to look like is a service economy. We've got to get back to a service economy, especially in these rural areas. I'm sure you guys know about the federal jobs guarantee that Dr. King originally proposed and is now being brought up again by many people. And I'm even trying to conceptualize in the Deep South, can we implement that on some sort of a state level? If we do that, not only does it guarantee a job at a living wage to anybody who wants one, because we have crumbling infrastructure. We need, pre-K, we need universal preschool, we need end-of-life care. We need people, where the hospitals are gone, coming to homes and giving health care to people. And so this is a way to keep the economy going, but it also actually incentivizes all these employers, whether they're from the state or from outside of the country, to pay people a living wage. Because if your laborers can up and leave your job at Volkswagen and go to the state and get a paying wage, well then they're going to keep up with the wage in order to keep their laborers. And so that's one of the things we've been talking about. But
the other thing I want to stress is education and the ties education to jobs. And what does that mean, especially when you have factory mill towns and now they're doing the new industry? Well, when that industry leaves, you have to change the whole curriculum of the schools because they've been incentivized to keep those industries in. That's one of the reasons why Google has a industry a storage plant that came to Alabama. Huntsville has NASA. And it's all these things targeted. And even in the Black Belt, there's a Chinese extruding copper firm that employs most black women as its middle management, and it's unionized, and it's in the middle of Greene County, which is one of the most rural counties ever, because of incentives. But those incentives leave, those jobs leave. Where do the employers go and where do employees have to go? But also to the education. If we don't have educated workforce, these new industries like Amazon, they can't get a job. They can't get a job at Mercedes. Even students from the University of Alabama cannot get a job at Mercedes because of just education, not having the training, not having the skills, but also, as they like to say, they're not cosmopolitan enough. And that comes from them. So it's a different type of education, a part of the labor force, but we need that hand in hand. And really, if the schools aren't part of that new solution, I'm not sure, because I could see those getting left behind, and even left behind when those industries leave, because not all can just up and go.
Yeah, so I guess first I just want to say thank you. This is really nice to meet you all. I'm actually from Virginia, and it's been a rough week for being from Virginia. And I left it the second time when I was in my early 20s. And as we were walking here, I was just talking to my husband about how I felt like there is no left in Virginia, so how can we pull left after this? And so it's really nice to hear from more people from the South who are legitimately from the left. The second thing I wanted to say was sort of about education. That I totally agree with you that education is important, partly for I didn't understand anything about tenants' rights or what I didn't understand any of those kinds of concepts of how people could organize and why that should be part of culture and society. When I was in the South, it took years of looking somewhere else to learn that stuff. So learning that, I think, could help people figure out how to best negotiate what kinds of industries do you want to come in, what kinds of programs, and also what you want from your government in terms of services. The other thing that I was curious your all's thoughts about was that my sense was always, and it's been a while since I lived in the South, but my sense was always that one big problem was that we never really reckoned with our real history. That there was all of this, Daughters of the Confederacy, just total BS that was fed to everyone. And every time I hear people talking about change, it's very centered in the present and not really forcing people to grapple with the real version of our history. And I don't understand how progress can really be made in a genuine way until you grapple with your past. And I was wondering if you all had thoughts on what you see going on in that end of things.
From a standpoint of film, we just experienced something that we've never had happen before in cinema history with 12 Years a Slave. It's a major Hollywood production about slavery from a completely black perspective. The memoir was written by a black man adapted the screenplay, and a black man directed it. So it was a unique and unprecedented look at slavery, because often those narratives are told from the perspective of a white content creator. But I also must admit that it seems that it's easier to make a black story that's set in the past, that's addressing racism, than to get a story like that greenlit if it's a contemporary piece. For whatever reason, I guess executives are more comfortable with slavery than contemporary stories of racism. But I think that the biggest issue is conversations aren't happening. And you see black movies come out and people won't go to the theater to see them, but thank goodness you can now stream it and see it. So I also see streaming as a revolutionary way to address issues, because you can watch a film and then have a conversation about the issues and themes within that film, because the film or television show serves as that icebreaker. So we're able to give anecdotes and talk about our lives as we live vicariously through the characters on the screen. So hopefully with the advent of streaming, with us watching, consuming content constantly, we will see more conversations happening about these issues that are uncomfortable, racism, and those issues of the past.
Can I say something about Virginia? I think the Deep South does a very good job of dealing with its history, especially in recent years, especially in the parts of the Deep South that have the most famous moments of bloody horribleness. Virginia always had, even in the days of, even in the days before the Civil War, always had this cult of civility going for it, a sort of reputation for moderation. You never saw anyone standing in the schoolhouse door like George Wallace circa 1963 in Virginia, but you did see a state government fighting desegregation tooth and nail on the court level, but always doing it in a coat and tie, and always doing it with a civil tone. In many ways, that's been more dangerous. The brand of what they called massive resistance in the 50s, which the phrase was basically invented by a Virginian. That form of massive resistance from the Upper South, the more moderate, the cavalier state Upper South, I think in some ways is more insidious than the hyper what you call it, the more flamboyant version that one sees during the Civil Rights era in the Deep South. And I'm not a bit surprised that the recent things have come to light about a Virginia Democrat, because Northam is a pretty good example of the Virginia Democrats I grew up with in many ways. He is, by the way, the first native-born Virginia governor since Doug Wilder. And for those of y'all who don't know, Doug Wilder was Virginia's African-American governor. And I think there's a certain poetry to that. Virginia is a state that people move to, and then they get elected governor, except for these guys, our actual African-American governor, and then one who tried to be an African-American at a party in a fictive form so many years ago. And I'm very happy this is coming to light. I'm actually, as disturbing as it is, for this to come to light about sexual harassment or carnival-style racism in these politicians' past, I say let's hear more. And not just from Virginia either.
Just briefly about the history, right? The history that we've all been taught in school was written by white supremacists who were trying to defend the idea of this white solid South, right? Any kind of dissent in the South, especially among whites, has been completely hidden. It was told by black scholars like Du Bois and so many others, but it was crushed down again mainly between the 30s and the 80s by these white supremacist men who are trying to paint, every white person in the South has this Confederate, in their family, and we should all be proud Confederates, which is not the case. There were tons of Unionists in the South, and there were even more probably anti-Confederates. But the fact is, the South, even the white South, has always been radical. There were black communists in the South. There were also white communists. Textile mill workers in the 30s were communists, not socialists, communists. And that type of history is not told. It's completely stamped out. Because if you want to maintain this white supremacy now, you've got to make poor white people feel like they've got some kind of stake in this long, this lost cause Confederate bullshit.
All All right, so I'm a historian because of my textbook that I had in 3rd grade, but I'm also a historian because of the family stories I heard on the porches of my relatives, who always told me the other history that was never in the books. So it was that corrective in there, but also too, my work at the University of Alabama and understanding the slave past started with a casual comment that a student said my 2nd semester at the university, and it's a black male. And he said, well, Dr. Green, slavery never existed here.
Oh, wow.
We have slave quarters on our campus. We have a slave cemetery. We have buildings who were built by enslaved people. We actually know who they were. But the myths that the university was telling its students as they were coming to grow from 35,000 to almost 48,000 students in 10 years still talked about, sadly, we lost, and this lost cause myth. So one of the things that I have seen, and not just developing an alternate campus tour and shedding this history to light, now approaching about 4,000 people reached, but that's a lot of my time, is digital humanities and building open source content that's not behind a paywall so people can learn about this past. So they read the transcriptions of some of the sales, they see this information, and one of the largest groups that I'm targeting is another phenomenon in terms of the schooling. Homeschools by black homeschool parents, because they're pulling their children out of the schools because of discipline issues, and they're concerned about what their children are learning today. And they are writing in, and I get their emails saying, thank you for putting this up here. I was trying to teach slavery, and I didn't want to teach it from the eyes of the enslaver. I wanted to know about the enslaved, and I wanted to know about the roles of the enslaved at these institutions. And telling that other narrative in an open source way and controlling the content, that because some textbooks are still, they haven't got any better from when I was a student in the 80s, but it's still my role in that oral tradition that I learned the alternate history from my family who insisted I knew it. Now I'm like, that's my job in the other way. And there's a lot of really good digital humanities scholars. That purposeful narrative that won't be in Pearson.
Well, interestingly, I have 4 kids. They're stair steps, 16, 15, 13, and 11. And I errantly say that we, my wife and I, homeschool them, but she actually homeschooled them up until about 4 years ago. And so she homeschooled in 3 states, New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. I mean, just to piggyback on what you're saying. But going back to the legacy of slavery on a campus, Keri's building is across the street from where she got her master's in history building, and then my building, the journalism communication building, is across another street from Baldwin Hall, which they found the bodies of enslaved people underneath the building when they were renovating it, and they removed some of the bodies. There's still some under there. It's a controversy that the university is trying to keep quiet, and incidentally, one of my white Jewish students did a documentary on this issue of Baldwin Hall. He also did a documentary on undocumented Latinx workers in the city of Athens, and it's just an example of how these students are using visual stories, visual communication to tell stories, and you can't really control it now because the internet is its own distribution channel. So it's good to see students that are encouraged and empowered and inspired to use their gift to tell those stories that some would like to keep quiet.
And just kind of piggybacking off of that, so the vast majority of Americans, when you ask them where they got their knowledge about the Civil War, it's film, right? It's film. It's Ken Burns' Civil War, which was made in 1990. And I started rewatching it. I haven't gotten through the whole series yet. It had been, since I was in my 20s, probably I was watching it. And the first, few sentences, he literally attributes the cause of the war not to slavery, but to states' rights, right? And they've got this good old boy Shelby Foote from Mississippi with this thick old Southern accent who gets about an hour's worth of time on camera. He's a journalist. He is not a historian. He has no degree in history. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's very much lost cause. And then you have Barbara Fields, the famous historian, one of the foremost scholars on race in the history of the world, who is, I think she gets about 8 minutes of time on camera, and then 9 documentary series. And she's the one that says slavery is the cause, and she's the only one in that documentary. Slavery is given about 2 minutes. No, 4 minutes so far that I've seen. 4 minutes to discuss slavery, which was about the same time they gave to just discuss one single battle between the Merrimack and the Monitor.
I just want to say one more thing, because I was trying to think of this thing that I saw recently when we were in Richmond that was like a new museum, and the labeling was insane. It was the Civil War Museum.
Museum of the Confederacy.
No.
Oh, not that one?
It's like some civil, it's like the old ironworks or something.
Oh.
And the labeling was just like, I mean, they really go on and on about the causes of the Confederacy. I don't remember what made me so angry, but they had this, how did you feel? What was your experience? So I wrote on this Post-it note what I thought about things. And then I went into the restroom and came out and someone had pulled the Post-it note down. And it wasn't like I didn't say any vulgarity or anything. I just said that I thought that they were like, that they had these like causes of the Civil War kind of banners, and like when you were looking at them, they had like something about slavery like up near the ceiling in like small letters, and like all of this big text about like family or heritage. It was, but I just thought if you all in your community is right to, I don't know, if you ever try to push for changes about things like that. But that's a contemporary place that I'm sure children go and people, feel like museums have some sort of authority, and it was just the same old shit.
Thank you so much for your panel. In recent headlines, I think last week it came out that Netflix is putting $45 million into turning the awful memoir Hillbilly Elegy into a major tentpole production. And I'm just curious, that we, know that these concepts of culture of poverty are debunked over and over and over again. As social science, they have no value. But as propaganda, as ideology, they clearly continue to play this vital role. So I'm just wondering if you had any reflections on that.
Oh, well, I did. I wrote about Hillbilly Elegy. It's in fact, I'm going to plug this. There's a version of my review of it that's recently out in a book called Appalachian Reckoning. It'll be out next month through West Virginia Press. But the short version is, J.D. Vance is retreading a lot of what Moynihan said about African Americans 50 years ago. It's the Moynihan report applied to his family and by extension what he calls Hillbilly America. The difference being, though, that Moynihan didn't use the work of Charles Murray to try to he didn't use, well, the bell curve hadn't been written yet, to be fair, but he didn't attempt to the same sort of neo-eugenic type argument that Vance uses. I'm not really sure what to say about that book that hadn't already been said. I'm not surprised it's going to go through Netflix. It was a bestseller. It was a problematic bestseller. There have been a lot of bestsellers that are problematic. I'm really, at this point, I'm not even sure I could call myself disappointed, because there is a market for that sort of thing. Literature that demonstrates a sort of hierarchy within whiteness, an intra-racial hierarchy, if you will. That's very popular. And that's something that Appalachia has been used for since, sometime in the late 1800s. Liz Catt, who occasionally writes for Boston Review, is doing some amazing research right now on the eugenics movement and the eugenics machine in Virginia in the 1910s and 1920s. And I encourage y'all to Google some of her work. But, I really don't have much more to say about Vance than that, except for to say that in defense of Moynihan, at least Moynihan thought he was doing the work of a social scientist. Vance is doing the work of a Silicon Valley millionaire who wants to demonstrate a kind of Horatio Alger story of his own to sort of describe the mud that he pulled himself up out of when in fact he had a lot of help along the way, including membership in the U.S. military and a bunch of friends he made at Yale Law School. So thank you for asking me about hillbilly elegy.
And I'll also say, and this is not a defense of the project, but it's a sound business decision.
Yes.
85% of productions, film and television in Hollywood are adaptations. It's a bestseller. It's a pre-sold franchise.
85?
Yeah.
Wow.
Then on top of that, you have Netflix. So you're not really beholden to the first week at the box office. So it actually makes perfect sense. It's controversial. It's something that will get press. And so I talked about streaming being something that could be used for good, but I think this is an example of how, because once especially if it streams and it does well, and we don't know if Netflix is telling the truth about how many people are watching something or not, Bird Box. So if it does do well, the executive that greenlit that production is going to be a hero, and they will then greenlight more productions like it. But it's a pre-sold franchise. It's a streamer. It's controversial. It's a bestseller. So it's like win. So I'm not surprised at all.
And it's telling the story, the culture of poverty story that elites want us to believe, right? That this is something self-imposed, that everybody should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And I just keep thinking back to that Martin Luther King line. Doesn't work if you don't have any boots, right? I mean, it's when policy and everything in the world is stacked against you, to be able to pull yourself out of cyclical poverty, and especially to be able to pull yourself out of cyclical poverty as a person of color in this country, is nearly impossible.
I have a question that maybe you don't have the answer for, but I'm curious about opioid use in the South and how people are getting such access.
Pharmaceutical industry.
So that's, it can't be that bad. Like, I'm from Georgia, and I went home to work over Christmas, and like half my family was zonked out. And I was like, what happened? They're like, oh, she got her shoulder fixed the doctor gave it. And I was like, y'all gotta be joking at this point. They can't possibly be giving you that many pills.
And I'm not a researcher. I'm a creative. But I have a personal anecdote that can speak to that. My first cousin's husband is in pharmaceutical sales. And, he talks about how, which is amazing and surprising.
How is all this, heroin was around when I was in college, but there was not this much heroin, and there was not as much pills. I mean, some people are getting heroin, but most people I know, there's more pills than there is heroin. And how are we calling it like nationally an epidemic and then handing it out? I'm truly lost.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I also can toss in media as well. I mean, the rappers used to talk about smoking weed.
Right,
now they talk about pills. So it's normalized through the culture. It's a crisis with the addiction. I hope I never get an injury because no one likes pain. But I don't know, that's my take on it.
And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they have lots and lots of lobbyists who are lining the pockets of politicians. And so, of course, they're going to do what the lobbyists want them to do.
And it's way easier to have that sort of lobbying on the state level than it is on the federal level. And the state level is where it ends up kind of mattering.
But at the same time, it's spending money on people needing help. But I guess they're not spending money on that.
It's the lack of infrastructure, the closing down of hospitals. You mentioned a place in Alabama, Polk County, Tennessee now is completely devoid of any sort of even, 24-hour urgent care type hospital, let alone a real hospital. It's something we're losing, and someone's going to come in and fill the gap at some point. It's going to be someone in the private sector. Well, right now, one of the private sector mechanisms that are using the South is the pharmaceutical industry. And it's not just the South either. I think opioid use is considered worse per capita in Pennsylvania than anywhere else east of Mississippi. I believe that's right. But places that have undergone some sort of economic hardship are statistically more likely to undergo that sort of noticeable drug problem.
It was also interesting for me, I grew up during the crack epidemic in the 80s. I was a teenager, and people who were addicted to crack were vilified. There was zero sympathy for them, and the war on drugs was designed to either lock them up or eradicate them from society. There seems to be more compassion and humanization of people who are addicted to opioids, and a lot of that has to do with race. So I find that incredibly ironic, to see how addiction is viewed in different communities.
Thank you all for coming out, and while listening to you all talk about the problems faced by different communities in the South, I was thinking of another community not too far from here, Brownsville, Brooklyn. And currently that's where I work. It's a place that faces a lot of similar problems to what you've described: drug addiction, failing healthcare system, a failing education system, and then also being the victim of kind of stereotypical narratives in the media. And so, like I said, I work for a community organization there, and something that we're really big on is collaboration. And collaboration includes working with other organizations like in the Bronx. The title of this is the Southernization of America. And so when these problems are broadly nationalized, even though the communities that are facing them are different, what possibilities are there for these kinds of alliances across borders, across state borders, across a rural-urban divide? And also, is that a desirable goal, or is that something that could potentially lead to the problems in Brownsville, where people might have more resources than Grundy County, Tennessee, are focused on more, to the disadvantage of
Place where people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks gathered with white activists like Miles Horton and Don West, and came together on a regular basis to talk about ideas for solving problems that they shared jointly across the racial divide. So I think we need to do that on a national level. Have these radical spaces, a kind of new version of Highlander Folk School, where that sort of conversation can take place. I think we're sitting in one, frankly. But when I think of Grundy County, Tennessee, the first thing that's going to come to mind for me is always going to be Highlander Folk School. Perhaps some of y'all have seen versions of that famous billboard that shows, it says Dr. King sitting at a communist school. That photo was taken at Highlander.
The other thing I was going to bring in, education. So I know Brownsville through my history of education work and the community action programming of the 60s and the strikes to reform the schools and to deal with the community taking over and what that curriculum is. And I think there's something about education, and a lot of times I'm Ainsley Erickson and the Columbia College Teacher College, they're doing some really good work. And a lot of them are thinking about how education is part of that solution with community organizing, because when I look at Brownsville, I don't see any difference in the people in the 19th century who wanted to reform their communities. They're asking for quality schools. They're asking for the same thing. So that I think learning the history of the area and how that inspire that generation, like, no, these are people still here. So inside Ocean Hill, Brownsville, that came out a couple of years ago, and a couple other works for History of Ed will be helpful. But also, too, John Hale is doing freedom schools out of Charleston, and they're using that citizenship model from the civil rights movement at SNCC. The Highlander, I have students who do that. They do a summer training program, so they're still there. So there's other ways to still bridge. But John Hill and the Freedom School projects and what's going on in Charleston and a couple other areas, he's really good. He's at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. He left College of Charleston and moved there. There's some really good on-the-ground modeling that's out here. But honestly, I think you're in the best place right now. Because I was like, can we bring this to Birmingham? Can we bring this to Tuscaloosa? Can we have something like this and transport it to us? And having that willpower and even imagination, because I think it's a Grundy County, especially with Highlander and what you're doing, but more of this, and also Skype and Zoom and virtual meetings and bridging communities that way. And I think that's the other way.
Well, and again, if we're going to talk about a third Reconstruction, we've got to talk about some major, major changes to the federal government, right? I mean, when we're talking about first Reconstruction, you got 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, you've got all the major civil rights legislation in the 60s. We need another major social revolution like that, where there's real changes to the Constitution, where there's real changes to government, getting money out of government. I mean, the stuff that the Democratic Socialists are talking about, it is absolutely unethical and unacceptable that we can be one of the richest nations in the world and have this kind of extreme poverty, to be one of the only developed nations in the world to have this kind of horrible healthcare system, no social safety net, mothers, especially black mothers, dying at rates that you'd be dying in a developing country. It is unconscionable. And I think the Poor People's Campaign and Moral Mondays and all of this stuff, bringing an actual ethical, it doesn't have to be religious, but some kind of ethical, moral drive to change what's going on now. It has to be at a national level.
There was something about bringing focus back to the title of this thing, the Southernization of America, being fully cognizant of the fact that we're here in New York City. And one of the things there's a few things that sort of comes up for me. When I think about the South, I think about belts, and in terms of understanding the solid South, and in terms of the Bible Belt, this, a place where both this history of race and racial oppression, as well as poverty, the highest concentration of poverty, exists also in this place where there's this battle theology. Whether people feel like they don't want to talk about religion or not, I think we got to figure out how to, talk about what role it plays for good and evil, or stay theological about it in place. I was also thinking about the poverty belt, Bible belt, solid South aspect, but when we bring it out and bring the lens out, right? I mean, the state of New York. I think about the way the social forces in this state, are distributed and pitted against each other, right? And along electoral politics, or along this sort of upstate versus New York City. I grew up in Illinois, and I grew up in rural downstate Illinois, but the dynamic between Chicago and downstate, the dynamic between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and what people call Pittsyltucky, that kind of thing. And so California, I mean, the relationship between places like LA and the Bay Area to, places like in Northern California. And so it's one of these things where I'm always struck by how, I live in a place here in New York City that has a kind of exceptionalism about, only in New York, right? This is and you spend time in Appalachian, it's like, well, it's an Appalachian thing. You wouldn't understand, And there may be an element of truth of it, and yet at the same time, I'm just really fascinated by the back and forth things and the ways that history can play out, like in Alabama, right? I did some work with UAW folk who were workers that were trying to organize under UAW, both at the Hyundai plant and the Renasol plant. And there's an example, right, where the history of the Black Belt, right, in Alabama is being used, right, to make profits. I mean, the dynamics around the workforce and the use of race and gender in that place. The profits are going not just to Hyundai or multinational, but the investors around the world. And so it's one of these things that the way that history plays, and also the way that what's particular about the South, but the way that it's actually, the opioid thing. And what I would, I'm losing family and friends back home, and it's hitting everywhere. So just to finally, I was struck by the fact you opened this up with Tom Watson, right? So that sticks as a guy that comes from the ranks of the working class, the white working class and the white section of the working class in the Midwest, and knowing the history of the South and labor organizing and everything, that the very same guy that could be so flippin' clear in that quote is also a guy who's responsible. I mean, what the term he took, why would anybody trust multiracial organizing, right? I mean, this guy became an arch segregationist. And so it's this, I guess it's still this thing, this plantation politics that, you know, to oppress people unevenly, right? And pit them against each other. And anyway, I don't know, it's a rant. Baby's getting upset.
Raising our fist with
But anyway, that was a lot. And ramble was good. You know, see what you can take out of it.
I know of another, I couldn't quote it word for word, but I know of another moment years after the Watson quote that Keri Leigh wrote down. Years later, someone asked him, you know, why did you suddenly become a race baiter? Or maybe not suddenly, it probably wasn't overnight. Between the populist 1890s up to the Red Scare era of 1919 and World War I. And he essentially blamed it on the South rather than accepting the fact that he had been an agent himself. He said, well, you know, William Jennings Bryan was dealing with the plastic West. And by plastic, he meant malleable, a society that's still undergoing change. While I was dealing with the rock-ribbed South. And that he basically was insinuating that he found by, say, 1910, probably earlier than that he was going to have to play ball with white supremacy in order to get anything done. When, in fact, all he ended up doing was playing ball with white supremacy. So one thing we do have to understand, whether none of us are in any danger of becoming like Tom Watson, but we do have to understand that we're the ones who make change. It's not the region that defines us, it's us that defines the region.
I was going to say the other thing is because I thought about the title thing. I just remembered after the 2016 election and knowing where Sessions was going, there was a lot of things about the Alabamification, and SNL really likes to make fun of it. There's a lot of things to make fun of. My state, we had the Love Governor, a whole bunch of other really major scandals there, but at the same time, those jokes really had impacts on our lives in that state, because one of the closest thing when we were starting seeing a lot of the policies that were implemented on the state level by him has now gone national. And a lot of other things too, the role of where the modern Republican Party on, and now they're on Fox News, they're on other things, so they're bringing local things out in viral in very clear ways. So it's when that comes in, I think that's the other reason why some of the coalition building started, because we knew what it would happen, because we saw years of it. And we also saw years of what voter suppression will look like with the IDs, and knew he was, and the first thing he did was drop the lawsuit about the voter IDs and do those other things. He was, so to hurt. And also the penalties. So I think this is when it became real of that national. But the other thing with the mapping of politics, if you look at the voting maps of Alabama in terms of black turnout, white turnout, you can go back to 1860, 1870. It looks the same over where slavery was too. It's a belt. Oh, and you can still see it. So when that is still replicated over and over and over in there. So one of the things that's been a challenge is, and also the joys, when Doug Jones was elected, we were all in doubt. We're like, okay, what's going on here? But when we realized, we looked at the map of what didn't come in, we knew he won before he got called, because what was left was the black belts. And what was left was 2 districts in Birmingham. And we're like, there is no other vote that's going to the Republican at this point. And they were willing to elect a person who got kicked out of office twice for not defying the law, and had some other history of sexual abuse and harassing young girls that was allowed to exist in northern Alabama too. But once we saw that, everyone came out, because we're like, we achieved and finally used those maps to work, because that's where we targeted. So I think it's like some of that history, that mapping, but also too where when people start bringing people from Alabama, you have to start questioning what Alabama are they coming from, and then go accordingly. no, we still have. Yeah.
Okay. And my, the third point is I wonder if you could tell us a little about this copper extraction business in Greene County, and how did it end up being unionized, and how did it end up hiring black women, and something else that I just want to say in terms of films, that I think it was around 82 that this property called The Jaws of Satan was filmed in Greene County, and it was the example of where there were jobs all of a sudden, but they only lasted a few months and then left.
Yeah, so the Tuscaloosa schools, Nicole Hannah-Jones really wrote about this, and then I came to, so I moved from North Carolina, so I taught at HBCU for 4 years after getting my PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. That was when my students came in, they're like, this is what you're going into. How are you going to fix these schools? So Tuscaloosa Public Schools was seen as the model for desegregation. Because one of the other things that happened with Central High, and where I have good friends who are now faculty members who are graduates from that school, and they came out in 95, the year's 99. When you start seeing this shift, and they're talking about rezoning, bringing different things. So you talk about gerrymandering. Our school district is so gerrymandered, so you can live across the street from Central High and go on a bus and take a half-hour bus ride. So to maintain who are the good African American students, who are the good proportion to go to that school. But it was a decision that was made to protect. One, I know why the black community supported it. They were afraid of their school being lost and the memorabilia being thrown out. What happened during desegregation of the other schools. And then you also had a university corridor bringing more people in who didn't want their children at certain schools. So there was one of the black school board members and some of the white school board, that was the deal that they had. And within several years, it went from the model school and very high level people, I'm thinking Jamie Grimes, well-known artists and other things, to 98% black. Physics wasn't being taught, AP was no longer taught, and you saw a quick change in curriculum within that same time. And now the next case is not Tuscaloosa, it's Gardendale. And we still have in Alabama some school districts that are still under mandatory court order for desegregation. So that's why Gardendale starts to matter a little bit more, because we know Tuscaloosa, we know the other school districts. If that goes, what's going to look like? And then what's the impact on, and especially for me, my biggest concern is I don't see people from Tuscaloosa. Other than my white students from Tuscaloosa, I don't see any students of color, and I know what happened because their curriculum's not there, they don't have AP, they don't have the same advantages that will help to get them into the University of Alabama, and I'm concerned that's going to spread. So it went from a model to one of the clearest cases of resegregation overnight. And as someone who writes about education, so when they're rezoning, I went in and was like, okay, so what are you going to do? It was written in such high-level legalese language that I was translating to the parents, because it was 1,000 people who came to see this meeting about rezoning to fix the problems of the past. I was in a room with a television monitor because I couldn't be in the main room. But I had to translate the documents to the people there because it was written in a way that they couldn't understand what was the best option. So using the expertise in my degrees to help try to fix, but when your school district who's like, oh, we're going to fix it, and they want to encourage you on the cheapest model that's not going to fix anything, you just need those people to still translate. And I think that's one of the things with Brownsville, I keep on thinking, you need those translators. Who are those community activists? And use the talents of the people there. But for me, it's one of where I can see my work going forward, and why I really think we need quality public schools. That's not just a slogan, that is something we need to fight for. And if people in the 1800s could do it, we can do it today.
Well, another anecdote to share. In the Georgia film industry, there are actually more jobs than there are people who are qualified to work. And at UGA right now, we have, I'm on the search committee for 2 different faculty searches. One in particular is a screenwriting position. And what was incredibly ironic is that of the 39, well, we have 4 more that just came in since I came here. So that's now what, 39 and 4 is what, 43. 3/4 of the applicants are from Los Angeles. And these are not people who are fresh out of film school. These are people who have credits, people who have written movies that you heard about. And they are willing to come to Georgia because the cost of living is so much cheaper. So they're in the gig economy in Los Angeles, and it's ridiculously expensive. I tell all my New York and LA friends that, Georgia's my last stop because, for you can get a mini mansion in Georgia for what people pay for. When I lived here in, what year was it? It was 2005. I was paying $2,000 a month for 1 bedroom. It was in Harlem. So I'm sure that probably costs a whole lot more than that now. $2,000. I mean, you can get like a 3,500 square foot house in Georgia. So you have all this brain drain who wants to leave Los Angeles.
Like Alabama and Mississippi, where there's not a lot of great jobs for people that have gone to college, especially. They come out of college and they leave the state. Yep. So your most talented young people are leaving the state and leaving the state in more poverty.
And oftentimes go next door to Georgia in Atlanta.
Right.
And Nashville. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about some labor struggles that you find that are interesting, either from the past or that are happening.
We don't have time. Give me a number, 3, 4.
Well, I mean, there's one. I mean, talk about Appalachia. I know I read a little bit about in 49, 50, the wildcat strike of the coal miners there against John Lewis and the union there, and they went on strike, and it was a strike not just against wages, and not just for higher wages, but it was against automation, from my reading. They introduced this autonomous miner, and the men there were having to work more dangerous, longer hours, and they said, essentially the question was kind of like, what kind of work should a man do? That was kind of put on, it wasn't just bread and butter issues, so it's sort of like really philosophical, on a philosophical level, seemed important to me. And then talking about the West Virginia teachers, last year.
Yeah, that was amazing.
So yeah, just talk a little bit about that. And just one quick thing about coming back to the title, I'm thinking of something that I read recently about, I guess going the other way, in a bad, Michigan, Indiana. He did really well. And this is pre-globalization. This is pre-immiseration. So to think of the white working class rising up and they're voting for Trump because there's an economic, we have to be attuned to that. No, Wallace did well in those places that a lot of racists are there, and white supremacy needs to be fought. It can't just be in terms of progressives. It can't just be on just a class basis alone. We have to really grapple with the history of white supremacy and look at that Wallace, kind of coming back now as Trump. What if he had Twitter? What if he had Fox News? Maybe he would have won back then too. They just were able to wrangle him in, but they didn't do that to Trump.
That's a lot of stuff. The 1950 United Mine Workers contract is notorious for being a job killer, and of course it did lead, of course, to a wildcat strike, and the scales falling from a lot of people's eyes when it came to the leadership provided by people like John L. Lewis, and the dude who took over for him, Boyle, was even worse. Who actually, whenever there was an internal insurrection within the United Mine Workers, especially among the Vietnam generation, by a guy named Jock Yablonsky, Boyle just had him and his family killed. And this, of course, leads to the feeding fuel to the fire for the demonization of big labor that you started here in the 1960s, continuing on in the Reagan era. Speaking of the Wallace issue, one of the biggest reasons that Wallace was even let in the door of those union halls up in Wisconsin, especially among the mostly white meat packers in places like Green Bay. The reason Green Bay is called the Packers is because of meat packing, or Milwaukee, places like that. He had, as an Alabama politician, opposed Alabama's so-called right-to-work law, and he was very rare among white Southern politicians in doing so. Otherwise, they wouldn't have given him the time of day. So for a moment, Wallace actually had some sort of cachet with organized labor that he was able to translate into a kind of white identity, law and order, what was it called? The hard hat movement, circa 1969, 1970.
Frank Rizzo in Philly.
Yeah, and by the time that Wallace had his come to Jesus moment in the 1970s after he was shot and decided that he wanted to run for governor yet again, but this time try to embrace the African American vote, the issue of organized labor was almost out the window. There are all sorts of problems within organized labor in the really the entire history of it, but the 30s through the 70s is a real demonstration of why you cannot allow your unions to have white male leadership and only that. I recommend a book by Jefferson Cowie called Staying Alive. It's a cultural history of labor in the 1970s that sort of demonstrates what exactly happened. And a lot of it can be blamed on organized labor itself. And we, as within the United Campus Workers, as a public sector, multiracial and LGBT-friendly organization, we're trying to learn from that awful past and make organized labor something new, not just based on the days of John L. Lewis and George Wallace.
But I like the connection you made, though, about the kind of psychological, re-examining of oneself when your job is gone, when your identity as a laborer is taken away, whether at that time or now, right? Trump did so well in these deindustrializing areas, because we are at a moment where there is a significant social, almost like a psychic death, right? We don't know who we are sometimes, especially, the masculine culture in the South. These men who have been breadwinners for their families for years are all of a sudden not able to provide. They lose a strong sense of honor, masculinity, and a lot of times I think that is what leads to the drug use. You need something to numb yourself. You need an escape.
But I do think what he's also saying, which is right, is that yes, it breaks you down, and then you have to go to your baser instincts, which is at least I have my white.
Right.
At least I'm white.
Right.
And I think that Wallace played on that, and obviously still happening, is going to continue to happen as long as we don't consistently call it out and say, no, it's not just class economics. Like, this is bold-faced racism, and it appeals to you because your whiteness is still the most important thing to you. Same with with the way white women voters have been voting.
Right.
It's not just that you are worried about your groceries. You're worried about your identity as a white person.
Mm-hmm. Right. If everything can be taken away from you, you start worrying about, is this last level of supremacy, my race, can that be taken away too? And one thing I do want to point out, though, is that we like to pin the election of Trump on poor whites and working class whites. The media, mainstream media does that all the time. Whites at every single socioeconomic level, at every single education level, voted for Trump at the same levels. And what I like to point out is, yes, no doubt any white person who voted for him has some sort of racism in them. But the people who are benefiting from this are the elite whites, right? The people that are benefiting are the elite whites. They're the ones sending the message out constantly. They're the ones telling, they're the ones in charge of media and propaganda here, and who are convincing people who aren't very well educated. People that are in failing school systems that have been taught out of textbooks, history books that are 50 years old, written by white supremacists. They're telling them a narrative they want and need to hear at some level.
And in schools like I'll just use my campus here because we are more out-of-state students than we are in-state students. Most of my students come from New York, they come from Illinois, they come from Indiana. So think about north straight down. And every year we have a racial incident with either Snapchat or YouTube, including one young woman from Upper Jersey. Last January got kicked out for using the N-word rant. So there's this comfortableness of the history in using it, but our students aren't from Alabama. So I think it's one of the things too, where seeing this and this back and forth in Southernization, it goes back to that history thing. There's an understanding for people outside the South that thinking it's okay to use certain words, to have certain things, and their questions and ideals won't be challenged. So I think one of the things is creating alternate spaces, having voices heard, having the other side listen to, so it's not just propaganda. And this is where I think people like Keri G. Woodson, because we are in Black History Month, so I will give a nod to this fellow Virginian. He developed this Negro History Week and that turned into this month to counter the what he called the historical propaganda that was coming out of academia, and to teach for 1 week that African American children in segregated schools, that they matter and their history matters. And I think that creating alternate spaces, creating films, creating these other things too, but also amplifying what is going on, I think to counter that propaganda, because that's never going away. And it's education and the uninformed are comfortable with not having to accept or think about what they're actually listening to. And also to disinformation and information campaigns through social media. It's comfortable if you're just listening to the same voices in that echo chamber without questioning who's driving that knowledge. And I know Virginia came up in the news this week with yearbooks. All Southern University yearbooks have this. Digital humanities, one of the things about Twitter historians, I love them this week, and especially the archivists. They'd be like, all of our stuff's digitized. Go look at it. You can go from Civil War up to the present, and you'll see across the board. So Virginia is not alone. North Carolina, my alma mater, has it too. Every school, but a lot of medical schools, look at those yearbooks and look at the politician base. So you will see that transverse that's going on, and there's something that's comfortable about race. And speaking of race, that gets cast against the South when it's not the South. It's a national and global issue.
It's so interesting, everything that everybody's saying. And thinking about the corporatization of the South, I've been doing some work on how the northern corporations before the Civil War built themselves on the South. So the insurance companies, the mortgage companies, the banks, the lumber industry, all of the livestock in Connecticut. I mean, all of the northern industry was basically founded upon a sort of symbiotic relationship with the South. And so it sort of feels like it's a repeat, or it's the same kind of thing going on now that started in the 1800s.
Absolutely. The South has been called a colonial economy by a lot of historians, colonized by the North, and still to some extent, as we were talking about, the major industries in the rural Deep South right now are car manufactured. I mean, and all international companies, right? I mean, Ford's not down there. And it is, they're given these huge tax breaks to come in and basically, poach really low-wage labor and have free reign to not have to give your workers benefits, to not have to pay them health care. A lot of these industries, and actually even we were talking earlier, the universities in the South are particularly bad at this. The university town schools are completely impoverished, and they have no other, the whole town is a university. It's a monopsony. There's one employer, so they can't do anything unless they actually leave.
Do universities in the north use companies like Cisco and Aramark for their?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's the system we all know.
We have 2 questions from online, from the live stream. So the first is, well, they're both kind of about labor in the South. The first is for the campus labor organizing. Does it
UCW,
yeah. Does it include adjuncts and GAs? As in, does it allow people who aren't fully employed or permanently employed to participate? And then the second question, which is more for for the whole panel, what's the role around organizing caregivers and care workers? I think it was mentioned specifically with the opioid crisis, but also how is politics in the South conceptualizing the role of caregivers and organizing them as well?
Well, the first question, the answer is emphatically yes. In fact, there's going to be a meeting this time next week for the adjuncts, the non-tenure track faculty member. I'm non-tenure track. I'm not an adjunct, but anyone who's drawing a paycheck from either the university or a Board of Regents school is an eligible member for the United Campus Workers. So make no mistake about that. That's they're very much included, whether they're adjuncts or what have you. The other question?
So organizing care workers, I don't know exactly the best way to do that, but obviously, these are people that are absolutely indispensable to society. Mostly women, poor white women and women of color doing these jobs, and they're paid nothing, and it's physically demanding, grueling labor. And again, that's why I think we have to think bigger, right? We have to think about if we had some of these federal job guarantees, we had a state job guarantee, or even a basic, UBI, basic standard of living. At that point, organizing becomes even less important because you have the state or the federal government looking out for your interests. You've got somebody actually paying you a living wage and giving you benefits for your work.
So if there aren't any other questions,
Anybody else has a question? Maybe that issue about the copper.
Oh. Thank you, because I asked, so one of the things about how I even learned about this company, and every year the University of Alabama takes faculty on a road trip around the Black Belt. So we get to know our community. And it's called the Golden Dragon company. If it's not in green, but it's called Golden Dragon. It has a very unique name. First thing I noticed when we came in, it looked like a mill town, and I'm from Massachusetts, so I know what mill towns look like. They had to base. It's a Chinese firm who got. It was their only U.S. based location. They got a lot of tax breaks to have that set up. They were allowed to bring Chinese nationals living in trailers because there was no apartments for them to live. So when you came in, you had 16 double wides, and that's where the trainers from China came in. From the community colleges were reconfigured to give the welding welding and other industrial arts so they can have employees to help with the firm. And it is one of the second largest employers. So when we came in, and other than having the live snake traps on the ground, all of us were like, it's a lot of black women who are in management. So we all asked, like, was this? And the manager, who was our tour guide for this facility, said they were the most reliable workers. All the young people that came in didn't come to job on time. They didn't do this. And I heard this echoed at when I lived out in the Outer Banks by the service industries out there. And their most reliable workers were 40-year-old and 50-year-old black women. And they didn't care about race because they didn't care about language. They had university as students as translators and training. They just wanted dedicated workers. And he jokingly said, black women, older black women who are grandparents are my best employee. So one of the things what happened was this firm that got in for tax breaks, it can then have this and is unionized, which is I didn't think could happen in that part of the state. They didn't see the history. All they saw was the bottom line and the work. So that was one of the things, and it still strikes me. I'm like, oh, okay. So this is the other Alabama, because of the other organization. I then met their spouses. A lot of those spouses were a part of Emerge Alabama and other things too. So it's outside people coming into the South of these industries, and that leads to some very unique changes. So it's not all harsh labor laws, but some unique pockets. And in this case, I think they built upon Alabama's sharecropping history. Robin D.J. Kelly's Hammer and Hoe talks about the organizing that was done by black and white sharecroppers. And it's part of these counties. So there's something there. But I think it's also one of these very interesting, like, oh, okay, this is not what I thought about Alabama. So even changed my perceptions too.
Any other questions? So I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much to everyone who came in on behalf of everybody who was here and listening online. Thank you so much for this really insightful and provocative discussion. It's one of many, and so we'll be following your work and hopefully see you back at the People's Forum soon. I also want to mention Reverend Barber from the current iteration of the Poor People's Campaign was here last week, and he committed to do a monthly session with us. So please keep your eyes open for further information. That's really exciting. And yeah, thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful evening, and we'll continue this discussion.
Thank you.